Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming out on this wonderful November day in Chicago. I have a great honor and pleasure to be in the position of asking Andrew Solomon to tell us stories from all these travels. I had not seen the video before, but this is, it completes the book in so many ways. It's different. Imagining you covered in ram's blood and then seeing you actually covered in ram's blood. Are you going to work on a longer documentary? Is this a trailer for a documentary?
I would be delighted to work on a longer documentary. So if anyone there is a documentary maker and would like to engage with that project, you're warmly welcome.
At the beginning of the book, you start by telling about a time when you first learned about the Holocaust. Can you tell us about that?
I was, I think, about 6 years old, and I was in the car with my father. We were driving to or from something or other, and he made a passing reference to the Holocaust, and it was clear that he thought I knew what he was talking about, but I didn't. No one had ever mentioned it to me. And when I asked him, he began to explain the Holocaust, and I couldn't make sense out of it. And I kept asking him questions and asking him to repeat himself, and understanding that as Jews, we were the sort of people who had been targeted, and that if we had been there then, it would have happened to us. And finally, he said it was pure evil as a means of ending the conversation. And I had one last question. I said, but why didn't those people just leave when they realized what was happening? And my father said, they had nowhere to go. And I remember thinking when I was 6 years old and he said that was not going to happen to me. And I thought, you always have to have some place to go. And though I had already been curious about the world and remained curious about it for other reasons, it was in that instant that I thought, I want to have friends everywhere. And I want to know that if the Soviets attack with a nuclear bomb, or if the fascists take power in the eastern seaboard, that I'm going to have untold other possibilities and places where I will be welcome. Now, that isn't the whole reason that I became a traveler. I was also interested in and attracted to the world. But that piece of fear, I think, was one of the strong motives of the way that my identity developed.
This also suggests that, and this bears out in the book entirely, that you do not think of yourself and do not operate as a tourist, but as a traveler, which is, I'd like to think, different. Do you think there's a difference? Do you see yourself as more than a tourist?
Well, more, certainly as other than a tourist. I mean, I think the idea is that tourists are people who have essentially gone to see a place and remain very detached from it, who have gone to look at it, but not to engage with it. And that travelers are people who have gone to try to understand another society and to become involved with and engaged in its dynamics. Now, I don't think anyone is purely one or purely the other. I think even people who are on a sort of group tour to a town in Mexico are going to have a certain amount of thinking, oh, this is quite different and rather interesting, and talking to people. And even people who describe themselves as seasoned travelers have their moments of tourism in which they think, gee, this is an amazing thing to see, but I can't quite put myself into it. But I had grown up with parents who were interested in tourism, and part of my quest, and part of the quest that this book describes, is the mission of attempting to become a traveler instead.
Your first travel, at least the first one in the book, was to the Soviet Union. What took you there? This was in 1991?
88 was
88,
when I first went. I was working
right.
for a British glossy magazine, and Sotheby's was having a sale of contemporary Soviet art in Moscow. And I was rather intrigued, and then I looked at the catalog and I thought, the art is terrible. And they're getting all of these rich and fancy people to spend an enormous amount of money to go on this ridiculously overhyped tour. I had always wanted to go to Russia, so I persuaded the editors of the magazine that I would do an expose of all of these manipulated people and their ludicrous excursion. And then I got to Russia, and my second day there, I was supposed to interview a group of artists, and the translator I had been promised by the Ministry of Culture failed to materialize. And I thought, well, I can't just leave them there expecting me. And so I went to apologize and explain I couldn't stay. None of them spoke much English. They spoke enough so I could get that point across. One of them said that a friend who spoke a little English and a little French would be coming later on. And so I stayed that whole day watching them in their studios. And it was an amazingly revealing experience because they showed one another these works of art that looked not very interesting to me. And they burst into laughter and they broke into tears. And I soon understood that these artists had worked in secret for many years, making work constructed in a way that appeared banal so that it would not attract the unwelcome attentions of the KGB, but that it was full of encoded meanings, that they had anticipated showing it only to one another. And the key to those encoded meanings was knowledge of the artists themselves. And over time, I came to understand that they believed that that undertaking had a great high moral purpose, that they were somehow in the process of keeping truth alive in a society that wished to annihilate truth itself. And suddenly they were confronted with a Western market. And as one of them, Nikita Alexeyev, said to me, you see, we have been in training to be not artists, but angels. And now, all of a sudden, it is a Western art world we are entering, and what they want is the things we've made, the works of art.
And then you returned in 1991, around the time of the breakup of the Soviet Union, and you witnessed it in the company of some of those same artists.
I returned in 1991 without knowing that I had come for the breakup of the Soviet Union.
It wasn't scheduled.
It was indeed. I had had a little bit of a rough spring. My mother had died and so on. I thought, I just want to get away. I finished my book about these artists. It was my first book. I thought, I will go and have a nice, relaxing time visiting them in Moscow and just hanging out. So I did have 3 relaxing days. And then on the 4th day, Gorbachev was kidnapped, and the right-wing extremists created the palace coup in which they took over the Kremlin. And I was with all of these artists, and they said, but we have to go and see what's happening, and we must help to build the barricades. And they gave me a kind of look of, are you still with us, or did you just come to get our stories and now you're going to go? And I thought, well, I guess I'm with them. So there were many, many episodes that are of note. I was particularly taken by the fact that at that point, many people in Russia wore T-shirts with Western writing on them without knowing what they said. And in building the barricades, there was a woman who had a sort of big Soviet, aggressive-looking woman who had jump-started a crane that she clearly didn't know how to operate and was trying to help build these things, was ordering people around while wearing a T-shirt that said, I'd rather be playing tennis. But on the 3rd day of the coup, I was with a few of the artists, and we had gone up to Smolenskaya, where some people had been killed the night before, and there were flowers on the ground and old women speaking about tragedy, and suddenly this young man came running up and said, there are tanks approaching the barricade. You all have to come help defend the barricade. And we kept hearing about tanks, and we really hadn't seen very many, and we didn't take it terribly seriously, but we sauntered up there, and we ranged ourselves in front of the barricade, hand in hand. And a few minutes later, a column of tanks rolled up. And I thought, this is not what I had in mind when I became an art critic. And the soldier on the front tank said, look, we have been given unconditional orders to destroy this barricade. He said, if you'll get out of the way, there's no reason to hurt any of you. But if not, we'll have no choice but to run you down. And the artists I was with said, give us just 1 minute. Give us 1 minute to tell you why we're here. And the soldier folded his arms and kind of looked down at us, and they launched into this incredible discourse. They talked about how these soldiers were young and didn't remember what real tyranny felt like, but they had lived in an era of real tyranny, and they could say how terrible it was. And they said, you say you are only following orders, but if you follow these orders, you have made a choice to follow them. The choice resides with you. And they launched into a kind of panegyric, a great praise of democracy that those of us who live in a democracy would be very hard-pressed to come up with. And when they finished, we stood there, wet, bedraggled in the rain, and this soldier looked at us for another full minute. And then he said, what you've said is true, and we must bow to the will of the people. If you'll clear enough space for us to turn around, we'll take our tanks away and we'll leave you your barricade. And the coup failed that night, and it didn't fail because of that episode, but possibly because of many, many episodes like it. And I had always wanted to think that being a writer or being an artist was serving some great, splendid ideal. And I had always been told that it was really nothing much more than entertainment. And in that instance, I thought, if you can only articulate the things that matter clearly enough, if you've worked on them for all of those years in that quiet privacy of showing work to your other friends, then you can be equipped when you get to the crossroads of history to have some tiny effect in shifting it away from where it might otherwise have gone.
Would you say now that that experience changed you, that had you not had it, would you have had a different career, a different way of thinking about art and writing and freedom and language?
Oh, it changed me utterly and profoundly. I mean, on the one hand, it made me think, having been a kind of frightened, anxious child, I thought, I can engage with the world, and when I do, it's a gratifying thing to do. But more profoundly, it gave me a sense of the purposefulness of writing. There's so much evidence that what journalism entails is neutrality. There are so many people arguing for journalistic neutrality. And I thought, actually, what I think one wants as a journalist is engagement and to be within rather than simply standing beside what happens. I hadn't known it was possible to do that. And it determined almost everything that I did in the years that have followed.
The story and then other stories in the book, there's a recurring theme of the intersection or interaction between art and politics in ways that are different from the ways in which art is distributed or experienced or appreciated in what we could call a free society. It starts, in the book, it starts with your experience with Russian artists, but also you write about China and Taiwan and South Africa. And we exchanged some, we talked about it in email preparing for this conversation. But I would like to hear you talk about the difference in which art and politics operated in such context rather, and the way it operates here. And what is that is overlapping between those two concepts, and what is entirely different?
Right. Well, I mean, there's some of it in that idea of not artists but angels, but also in many of the societies I've written about, there was an enormous suppression of artistic expression. Now, the purpose of that is that art should all serve the propagandistic version of events for the state. That was true in Russia, it was true in China. In Afghanistan, where I also wrote about artists, art was simply to be repressed entirely because it represented a kind of freedom that the Taliban didn't want to endorse. My finding is that when you say art is forbidden, what you're implying is that art is powerful. Our system, in which nothing is forbidden and you can make any kind of piece of art you want and show it wherever you want to hang it, more or less, is one in which art is relatively disenfranchised. But I also think that a lot of the time, people who are engaging with societies abroad, especially journalists engaging with those societies, engage with two categories of people. They engage, on the one hand, with politicians and business leaders, most of whom have an agenda and are giving rather predictable and rather purposeful responses. And then they quote the so-called common man. They say, and then my taxi driver said so-and-so, or the guy who cut my hair, or the person who served dinner at my hotel. And I really believe that there is a kind of layer of people who are engaged in and who are thinking about their societies. and that especially in these oppressive societies, many of them become artists, and their becoming artists is something full of politics and determination and very complicated content. So I think, for example, of a work that was done by a Chinese artist named Zhang Peili. Zhang Peili had become obsessed with the fact that everyone in China heard news of what was happening from the woman who was the newscaster on Chinese television. And after she had reported, insofar as it was reported, on what happened at Tiananmen Square, he thought whoever controls the words of this woman controls China. And he thought, I want to get her to say something of my choosing. And he did some research about her and discovered that she loved flowers more than anything else. So he wrote to her and said, I'm doing an exhibition which is of flowers, and in it there will be a waterfall. And he thought I had to come up with a text that is neither hers nor mine, that is somehow neutral. And he chose the encyclopedia entry about water. And he said, to run in the background of my flower exhibition, I would like to record you doing this. And he offered her money to do it. And she agreed. So if you came to the exhibition and you didn't know anything about Zhang Peili or about what he was doing, it was an exhibition of flowers with a video in the corner that had a lady talking about water. But if you did understand the messages of the avant-garde, you understood that for that brief moment, through the use of money and determination, Zhang Peili had determined what China's primary newscaster was saying. And even though what she was saying was not significant, he had thereby approximated the position of Deng Xiaoping. Now, there were many people who came and only saw flowers, but there were many people who came and saw that, and it gave them a kind of confidence and a feeling of power and an energy to drive forward in the process of reform that would never have existed without that kind of artistic expression and manipulation.
That's a great story. There's also a great story you tell in your piece about Burma, Myanmar, about an artist, a person. He was not an artist when he went to jail, but in jail he started painting. He discovered painting. And then through incredible difficult circumstances, he found ways to actually paint, required reconfiguring uses for certain things. And then he also became friend with one of his guards. Could you tell us that story?
Yes, the artist is named Tian Lin, and he had learned a little bit of drawing. He was in the student protests. He then got put in jail. And when he was in jail, he had a guard, and he started telling him about art. And this guard had never heard of art. He had never seen a painting. And Tian Lin eventually said, well, you know, I could make you some art. And he was just a way to engage with the guard and a way to have something to do. And what he did was the prisoners in that prison were given strips of cloth that they were intended to use as toilet paper. And he saved half of this abraded cloth from old prison uniforms. And he had a cigarette lighter that had a wick. And he pulled out the wick. And he got this guard to bring him house paint. And he began doing painting. And bit by bit, he arranged for those paintings to be smuggled out of the prison so that they could be collected elsewhere. And they're the most unbelievable, arrestingly beautiful drawings. And sometimes they got confiscated. People thought he was making a map of the prison as a means of escape, which was not the case. They were smuggled out to his family. His family managed to give them to the British ambassador, Vicky Bowman. When he got to the end of his imprisonment, when he was finally let go as reform began to take hold in Myanmar, all of the paintings were shown at an exhibition in Yangon. And he invited that prison guard who had brought him the house paint to come and be a guest at the opening. And he was. And then he married the British ambassador. I mean, Tian Lin married the British ambassador, not the guard.
The guard married the first secretary. Those are wonderful stories because it reminds us, it reminded me of how powerful art is, that this enfranchisement by way of censorship. So of course, it's not an argument for censorship. It's an argument against censorship in some ways because the art as the desperate act of dignity is, it's very noble, but at the same time, you do not want to have people committing desperate acts of dignity. You want them to have access to dignity all the time. We also talked earlier, Andrew Solomon is president of PEN America, and part of the mandate of PEN is to fight for freedom of expression in this country and all over the world, supporting free expression. Can you tell us about your work as PEN president and how that complies with what we've just talked about?
I can, and I'm going to start, though, with an anecdote also from China that relates to the larger point that you were making. And that is that I was talking to a group of artists in China about Tiananmen, and I was there in the early 90s, so fairly soon after the events of 1988. And one of the artists who had been among the protesters of Tiananmen and had been shot at said to me, of course, he said, we were fighting for what we believed in. He said, but in many ways, it's a good thing they reacted as they did, because if they hadn't, there would have been revolution in the streets, and there would have been chaos, and hundreds of thousands of people would have died. And I said, but surely what you wanted was to move toward democracy and to fight toward this. And one of the other artists said, idealism in the hands of an artist is a beautiful thing. That's our right. He said, idealism in the hands of a leader is terrible. These contradictions that trouble you Americans don't trouble us so much here at all. The question of what constitutes freedom is very widely defined, and one of the grave mistakes that has been made by many people, including a recent president of the United States who went into Iraq, is the belief that somehow freedom is the natural state that occurs when you lift the constraints against it, that it automatically emerges. In the work I've done at Penn, what we've seen over and over again is that when you remove the constraints that are around freedom, when you remove the constraints around free expression, you get an interesting and engaged society in which people are able to communicate well with one another. But when you remove the constraints that there are around freedom in general, what ensues is chaos. And you can't knock out an ugly system and expect that a beautiful one will somehow rise by itself in its place. So at Penn, we're constantly working on this issue of freedom of expression. How do we ensure freedom of expression? We're fighting back when the Saudis decided to imprison a Palestinian poet on grounds that his poems constituted an incitement to atheism and sentenced him to death. We worked to commute that sentence, which is now just many years in jail, which is an improvement of some kind. We look at all of the times when voices are silenced and at the ways in which societies become depleted when those voices are silenced. We're always trying to give people the freedom to express themselves. I was saying backstage that I think there is a sense in which we have, a kind of obligation. There's the old obligation that a wealthier nation should help a poorer one. But there's also an obligation that a country in which people are free to speak should help a country in which they are not. And I always come back to Aung San Suu Kyi's beautiful line, which she used in an article she wrote some years ago for the New York Times. She said, please use your freedom to promote ours. And Penn is about that obligation.
One of the great things in the book is that it covers a range, a historical range, a historical period during which many things happened, from the demise of the Soviet Union to social changes, and you have this knack for being there for that. But also, after the original text is read, there's a comment afterwards about the aftermath of those things. And it's not always encouraging to see that some of the promises that you were recognizing in the originally published text were not fulfilled. I wonder how do you look at that? I wouldn't say that hope is extinguished, but it goes to show that it's not always, not all of the promises are fulfilled. The promises of at the end of the Soviet Union, the promises in South Africa, the promises in Burma have not been fulfilled fully. How do you handle that? How, you as a person, you as a writer, and you as a president of PEN, how do you keep working toward a goal that might be unachievable?
Well, there are two pieces to that, and we were talking about it a little bit in relation to your own experience with Bosnia. The first is to say that all of the hopes are never fulfilled. All of the hopes are not fulfilled anywhere. All of the hopes are not fulfilled here. That doesn't happen. So you have to go in and understand that hope is hope. It is not prediction, and that things will not unfold in a smooth and easy way. But I also think, I mean, funny enough, two of the societies you mentioned, South Africa and Myanmar, there are terrible problems. The problem of the treatment of Muslims of the Rohingya in Burma is horrifying, and there are many, many issues in South Africa. But those societies are both better than they were when I first engaged with them. Russia, on the other hand, has slipped back to a point at which it is effectively a dictatorship again. Many other societies have. These are broad generalizations. I don't want to kind of spend the next hour and a half parsing the distinctions. Many of them have not actually become better. I think one has to recognize life and thinking that exists in the present tense. And I think of one of the Russian artists, Andrei Reuter, to whom I said when we were talking about the book, after I had finished it, so I then squeezed his remark into the final edition, and I said, remember what that time was like? And he said, oh yes, that time when we had so much hope. And I said, do you regret having allowed yourself to hope so much when what ensued has been so gruesome? And he said, even if all of the hopes had been completely disappointed, he said, and some of them were not disappointed, but he said, even if they all had been, I would have had that moment of hope. And that's something I would have carried with me for the rest of my life. And I have carried it, and it informs every painting I make and every interaction I have. And I came to think that having had hope is like having a happy childhood. It does not mean you will have a happy adulthood, but it equips you better to deal with the difficulty. And while some people, when their hopes are disappointed, become cynical, many people who have had that experience of hope go on formulating new hopes, different hopes, perhaps lesser hopes. It's the only way that major social change actually occurs, is through that repetitive hope. And a lot of the time that hope is not only a matter of someone sort of having a spirit which is inclined toward it, it's also a matter of discipline. It's a matter of saying, if we give up on hoping, if we don't hope for anything anymore other than what we already have, then we will never have anything. And so hope itself becomes a deliberate and I think a very political act.
Ta-Nehisi Coates writes in his book proposing the concept of struggle, which I think is a little more opposed to hope, but I think that hope and struggle complement each other in the sense that you were talking about, so that rather than being disappointed for not fulfilling the hope, about not fulfilling the hope, it is just a means of struggle to keep finding new goals, new things to achieve. One of the great things about the book is that it talks about history and human experience in its most extreme ways, in its most extreme examples, both on the good end but also on the bad end. So you visited Cambodia and talked to women and people who were extremely traumatized by the genocide in Cambodia. But also you had splendid vacations, which including a culinary vacation in China and a sailing in Turkey that made me want to reconsider my summer plans all over again. And I like, one of the great things about the book is precisely this, that the world is both things. It is not just reports from the killing fields, but also there are these things to enjoy and things to appreciate, the whole range of it. But you also say that authenticity is the holy grail of the traveler. So in those extremes, are the authentic things, are they different, or do they complement each other, or is the experience of authenticity necessarily combining both of those extremes?
I wondered, as I was putting the book together, whether I should include the fun travel pieces, and some reviewers seem to be very pleased I did, and a couple of reviewers seem to think that it's bizarre to go from luxury hotels to the killing fields. My point of view is that these are all ways of engaging with the world, and that I wanted to remain as engaged as I could. I found that often when I went off to do what was effectively a travel story, that there were little surprising moments of authenticity that would creep in one way or another. But I also believe that there is an authenticity in one's own experience. And that assignment to write about Turkey, which was my first from a travel magazine, Travel and Leisure, where I then did a lot of writing, that was an exhilarating and wonderful experience. And I think if you're trying to paint in some measure, I mean, insofar as you can in a few hundred pages, a portrait of the world as you see it, it can't just be a portrait of heroes and tragedies. It has to be a report also that there's a lot in the world that's very beautiful and a lot in the world that's very exciting. That sense of authenticity, am I seeing the real place, came up for me over and over again. I'd always wanted to have those real experiences. I'd wanted to have them really from quite early in my life. And my favorite, I think, of the ones that are in here is when I was in the Solomon Islands, where I had gone, because after all, if your name is Solomon, you want to see the Solomon Islands. So, leading a trend in eponymous travel, off I went. And I went with a high school friend and her husband and my husband, the four of us together. And my high school friend's husband worked for Conservation International. And he said, well, there's someone who works for us who's been living on the ground and married a bushwoman. He said, if you really want to have authentic experiences, he could take you up into the heights. He said, people don't generally go there. And I said, well, that would be great. One thing you should know about the rainforest is that it rains all the time there. We had a 2-day trek through all of this mud, and we came to this small village, and we had the sort of greeting ceremony and so on that comes whenever anyone comes. They hadn't seen foreigners other than the person leading us for many years. Late that night, we were just getting ready to go to sleep, and we suddenly heard the sound of music. And we looked out, and they had taken out their various kinds of pipes and a kind of drum that they played with the soles of rubber flip-flops, and they were playing music for us. And they played this beautiful music, and it was so enchanting. The rain had cleared, there was a full moon, we were sitting there bathed in moonlight, and there was this uncanny music coming toward us. Well, they finished, and they said, we were so moved, and one of them said, do you have music in your society? And we said, yes, of course. And they said, sing us something. So we looked at one another and we thought, okay. And we came up with Oklahoma and Jamaica Farewell and America the Beautiful. So after we'd done that, they said, what about dancing? So they went back to playing their music, and my high school friend and I, who had fortunately done it many times before, stood there swing dancing in the middle of the jungle on top of a mountain under the full moon in the Solomon Islands. And I thought, travel is always, always, always about reciprocity. And the time when you get to know other people is frequently not when you are sitting there asking them, peppering them with questions, but in those moments when you say, if you'll show me your authentic self, I'll show you mine.
All that while dancing. Well, one of the interesting things, I think this is the most compelling thing about the book. You are so good at paying attention to other people, and not just being observant and noticing details that are very memorable, but listening. The book is full of stories and testimonies of other people. Clearly, you listen to others well. What is interesting to me is that in some ways it provides a counter-narrative to the situation of depression. And of course, famously, greatly wrote about it in the Noonday Demon. So is it travel in some ways the opposite of depression, the total engagement with the world, as opposed to painful disengagement that comes with depression?
That's a fascinating question. I've never thought of it in quite those terms. My usual line would just be that the depression book was about resilience. How do people take experiences of great pain and turn them into occasions for dignity? And that this book is also about people whose pain came primarily from external rather than internal sources, but who also managed to find a lot of dignity. But I think you're right that there is a real opposition there, because my sort of trademark line on depression is that the opposite of depression is not happiness but vitality. And travel is a matter of enormous vitality. Thank you for your words about listening. My mother used to say when I was growing up, a good listener is always more interesting than a good talker, despite the fact that I'm talking away at you right now. I think there is a sense in which, yes, one of the central symptoms of depression is that everything becomes too frightening and too overwhelming, so that I can barely talk to my husband and children, much less talk to a large group of people or go into an alien circumstance. And travel and the work I've done with travel is about being as fully engaged with the world as it's possible to be. And it is a kind of counter-narrative to the depression. Thank you for that. That's a gift you've given me.
Oh, thank you for saying. One thing I want to ask you while reading this book, where haven't you been? That is, where would you like to go? Do you have plans? Is there a new territory for you to explore?
I'm going to Sri Lanka in August for a travel magazine, slightly with the feeling of, but I finished my book, I don't have to go anywhere, but maybe I will anyway. The place that I lack most centrally is the Gulf states. I've been in various parts of the Islamic world. I reported from Libya, from Afghanistan, from Kazakhstan, from Turkey, but I haven't done the Gulf states in the central part of the Middle East, and there's so much history going on there right now. I recently said to my son, who was then 6 and has just turned 7, I said, George, I said, if you could go anywhere in the world, I said, where would you most like to go? And George thought for a minute, and then he said, Syria. And I said, Syria? George, why would you want to go to Syria? And he replied using a phrase that I'm afraid has come up often in our household. Someone has to tell those people about inappropriate behavior.
Someone does, yes.
As one friend said when I recounted that story, perhaps he'd like to visit Washington, D.C. while he's at it.
I was wondering also, let's imagine a situation where someone like you is visiting the United States, coming from some remote place, with some knowledge, but not all of it. What would they see? Can you counter-project yourself into someone else's position? If they were visiting the United States these days, looking at things, what do you think they would see?
Well, I think the United States is not a very singular place, and what they would see are these divisions which have become so evident in the current electoral process. They would see that there is, on the one hand, a society of greater acceptance than there has ever been really more or less anywhere in the world. And on the other hand, that there is a society of gross intolerance and demagoguery and anger and rage. I know they would see the social inequalities which have become so pronounced and which are so visible all around us. I think that they would see that we are a country in which there is a constant supply of hope, that people here really believe that things can change. I was very struck when I was doing my previous book by a difference between European psychoanalytic texts and American ones. The European ones tend essentially to say, the purpose of this is to recognize your limitations and adjust to them. And the gist of the American ones was, the purpose of this is to recognize your limitations and transcend them. And that it was a real divide. And I think for all that is broken in this society at the moment, and I could talk for the next 4 hours about that, I think there is still a sense people have of having some volition, not only in what they do, but in who they are and how they live.
That sense of agency is something we cherish in this country too, but it's also a kind of agency that can be practiced in writing and storytelling, including the agency to listen to others and give them voices vicariously. In that spirit, I am now going to open the floor to you. The microphone is there for your questions and comments and ideas.
Thanks for coming here. So I wanted to kind of ask you, I think it's not so difficult to be a traveler. So like for me, I've been to Syria, I've been to Sri Lanka, I've been to Bosnia, I've been to a lot of places. What's interesting to me is how do you become a chronicler of that? How do you communicate all these places that you've seen and be successful at it? Oh, I wanted to tell you, in the Gulf, you should go to Oman.
Excellent. Thank you. I mean, chronicling is sort of the way that I engage with the world. So I write notes through whatever I'm doing and whatever is happening. It also, the fact that I'm going to chronicle something forces me to try to see it clearly and not to be distracted by the easiest or most pleasant narrative. So I think the fact of writing has a very strong effect on, the fact that I will be writing has a strong effect on the way that I travel. And I wouldn't travel the same way without it. And then I think it really is just trying to talk to people. I mean, I said before, there is that middle stratum of people. I feel like all of you who are here today in the Art Institute of Chicago, some of you might actually be in government, and some of you might actually be struggling at the bottom of the social ladder, but most of you are probably somewhere in the middle and are probably quite interested in what is happening in this country, in the world, how we understand and explain it. And I feel like there is a vast swath of people who get very little written about them or said about them, who have really interesting, witty, engaged, insightful things to say. When I go someplace, I find you meet a few people, and then you're suddenly in a network. But then you think, what if this isn't the real network, and you have to meet some other people and allow that to expand into its own network. And that process of engaging with more and more and more people, which I will say I still find intimidating when I arrive somewhere. I'm still anxious, and I still always have my first few days. Myanmar, where I went just a couple of years ago, I felt crazy at the beginning, and I thought, it's too complicated, I will never understand it. But if you talk to enough people, bit by bit, it sort of comes clear. And people then suddenly begin materializing. I mean, when I was in Afghanistan, I went to Afghanistan in February of 2002 in the late stages of the invasion, and I was terrified to go, and I thought it would be a fascinating but unpleasant experience. And I loved Afghanistan. I have not loved every place I've been, but I loved Afghanistan. And I was walking one day with my translator. I'd said I wanted to get one of those fur hats, like the ones that Karzai always wore. There we are. I'd wanted to get one of those fur hats like the ones that Karzai always wore. And my translator had said, well, then we must go to the street of the hat makers and order one. So we ordered one, and we went back the next day to get it. And we were walking back through a crowded market. Most of the foreigners who were based in Afghanistan at that point were either military or UN, and they were forbidden to sort of go and mix in the streets. My translator said, it's just a market. Nobody is expecting a foreigner. It's perfectly safe. And as we were walking through the market, he said, put on your hat. And I said, oh, Farouk, I think foreigners going native look silly. And he said, no, really, put on the hat. I said, all right, I'll put on the hat. And I put on this hat, and everyone around us burst into applause. And I didn't understand what was happening, and someone stepped forward and he said, you are a foreigner, I think you are an American, but you are in our city, you are walking among us, and you are wearing a real Afghan hat in the Afghan way. And we want you to know that you are welcome here. And it was one of the most touching things I'd ever experienced, because it wasn't an interview I'd set up, and it wasn't anyone whose name I even was going to get. I find that when you get to places and you begin engaging in that way, the narratives begin to emerge, and then I just write them down.
I just want, what's your education, and how did you become a writer, and how is it that you're successful at it?
I did a master's degree in English and a PhD in psychology, and I'm successful at it only because I have pushed endlessly to get my words out into the world in a way that I'm sure is frequently obnoxious, but that's the key to success. Yeah.
Mr. Solomon, I really enjoy all of your books. I have a request. I am from northeast part of India. People don't know much about us, not even non-Indians. Indians don't know about us. My part is in between Bangladesh and Burma. That's where we grow tea, and we treat women much better than the other parts of India, and I'm proud about that. But, you know, recently there are a lot of things happening. You know, people are killing people, thinking about they are the witches and all. So people don't know about all those. And we are very famous for one-horse rhinoceros and beautiful place, but people are killing the rhinos, you know. So I think through you, maybe we can get some awareness and somebody would like to know about it and start something against it. This is just my appeal to you because I love your books. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have been in India a number of times, but I have traversed only a tiny part of it. I feel like there's so much there to see and know. I would love to do that. I'm very interested in the natural world. There are a number of essays in the book that are about animals and about the natural world. The decimation of the rhino population is extremely alarming and altogether heartbreaking. And you're telling me that the food is really good will go down very well with me. And I will just say parenthetically that the China story that Alexander mentioned, in which I was writing about, it was a culinary tour of China. At the end of it, having spent almost a month eating enormous meals all day, every day, I went into a store in the fashionable 798 district in Beijing, and I said, I really love the jacket you have in the window. Would you have that in my size? And the very polite Chinese saleswoman looked at me and she said, no, we make clothes for thin people here. Yes, microphone too.
So often, deeper meanings are lost in translation. How do you engage your translator so you don't miss that deeper meaning?
The difference between having a good translator and having a not very good translator is enormous. And I've had the very frustrating experience of being with translators who didn't seem to be able to get across the questions I was asking or the answers that I was receiving. And it can be very, very, very frustrating and difficult. I often try to ask people who are within the community that I'm trying to address whether they would be a translator for me. You know, you are a painter here in China. I know your job is to be an artist. Would you consider working with me for a few weeks while I do these interviews? Because you will understand not only the language, but also what the ideas are that are being thrown back and forth. But when you have something translated, whether it is in writing or it is in the course of speech, there's always the question of what is getting confused or getting lost. When my book about depression had been published in several Asian languages, a friend who speaks those languages looked at a few of the translations and said, in Taiwan, you've written a medical textbook. In Japan, you've written a book of poems. And in mainland China, something between the two. So I'm always very aware, and I'm not good at languages, and it's very frustrating to me that I rely so much on translators. I sometimes try to come back to people, and I try to choose the translators very carefully. It's surprising how quickly you can figure out that you aren't getting all of what someone else is saying, or that they don't understand what it is that you're saying. But it's a big challenge.
Thank you. We have a question over here.
Have you been the kind of traveler that you've been overseas? Have you been that kind of traveler in this country, in communities that are very foreign to you? And if so, what's the difference for you?
You know, I've traveled a lot within the United States. I've traveled a lot especially because I get sent on sort of book touring and so on to various places or lecturing. Also, I have a daughter with a college friend. Mother and daughter live in Fort Worth, and so I go down to Texas quite a lot. And my husband is the biological father of 2 children with some lesbian friends in Minneapolis, so we're in Minneapolis a lot, which is where my husband was living when we met. So I've had a lot of time in those areas. Of course, I love coming to Chicago. The exotic aspect of travel in America, in my experience, mostly has less to do with the location. I mean, some of the locations are beautiful and some of them are less beautiful. It has more to do with trying to understand the politics of people who have different points of view and trying to engage across the socioeconomic spectrum. And I did a lot of that in my last book, Far From the Tree. I interviewed many, many families who were struggling and who had children who presented various kinds of challenges and special needs. And it often felt to me as though it was a good thing that I had spent time in South Africa and Peru and Brazil, because it prepared me for going into a context in which the way of living was so very different. And I have certainly met people whose experiences were very troubling. I've often been humbled by the breadth of the perception that they have been able to establish in lives that have been very constrained. And that's really been the gist of that experience of travel.
I think we have time for one more right in front there.
Hi, I was wondering how all your travels have changed your sense of home and what it is that you want out of being home, or how it's changed the kinds of places or what you call home now.
The experience of travel strengthens, I think, the sense of home. I have a theory that if everyone in the world were required before the age of 30 to spend 2 weeks in a foreign country, no matter what country and no matter what they were doing there, that half the world's diplomatic problems would go away, because I think people have so little sense of otherness and so little sense of the idea that other people aren't just us with, funny accents and different hair. Other people have other systems of values and other ways of doing things. And furthermore, they don't want to become us. They may want to change things in their society, but not in that regard. So I think that's that's central to the conversation. And then I think that travel is, for me, has been a way of being distilled. I mean, travel is both a window and a mirror. When you go to another place, you see things that you've never seen before. That's the window part. But you're also stripped of a lot of the things that are signifiers in your usual life. You no longer have people who understand the meaning of your education or your clothing or your sort of location. And what you get stripped back to is a kind of essential self. And for me, it has been very helpful, not to turn this all into an ego exercise, but to find out who I really am by going to those other places. And then when I come back home, to being able to think, now I'm home, and some of the things that I thought were necessary for me to be myself turn out to be expendable. I was kind of an Anglophile growing up. I eventually went to graduate school in England, and I stayed there for a number of years. I took a second passport. I'm a dual national. A lot of my closest friends are Americans who live in London or English people who live in New York. Because I think if you do a lot of travel, what you ultimately end up with is a sense of permanent displacement. And you must know this as well, Alexander, and you end up feeling you have something closely in common with other people who are somewhat displaced. But since having children and since having the full-time experience of being a parent at home, I've developed an affection not only for the United States, which for all its ups and downs is a country that I love, but also for my own experience of home and the rootedness it brings. And I used to think I would get melancholy during takeoff in airplanes. And I know that when you go to higher altitude, it changes the way your taste buds function, and that there are all of these other explanations I had looked at, and I kept trying to figure out the physiological reason why often as the plane takes off and in its first hour in the sky, I feel kind of tearful. And I finally realized that it's not a physiological response. It's that I find those departures painful. I find departing from home increasingly painful. Then I get somewhere else and I find arriving someplace joyful. But that underlying little piece of me that yearns for the place I came from and the place where the people I love the most are all together, that never goes away. And I understand it in a way I never would have without travel.
Well, we have to send you to the place you came from. You have to catch a plane. You're always welcome to Chicago.
Thank you.
I thank you for myself and for all of the Chicagoans who are here today. Come back anytime. We'll arrange better weather maybe next time.
Thank you all. Thank you, Alexander.
Thank you.
That was a lovely interview.
Thank you. I enjoyed it very much.